Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 13th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. I'm actually leaving the country for a few weeks, a little over a month, starting this week. But don't you worry, I have recorded every episode for while I'm away and gotten them all squared away and ready to go. So I'll still be airing the show uninterrupted. I'll still be available via, social media, or if you reach out on Patreon. The internet is everywhere. It's just not always as reliable. So, yeah, it's pretty typical that I record, some of my episodes in advance, at least by a few weeks, because of the process of how we go through and work on the show. So let's talk about the show. Let's talk about it. But before we do, you know what? I want to thank those of you who continue to support the show. I know these are really, really, really tough times for everybody. My show got canceled. Fun, my newest TV show. So I don't really have any income for this foreseeable future. That's why the podcast has been so important to me, especially as I gear up to go back to school in September and start paying tuition again. I took the summer off because of the pandemic, but I'm not allowed to take 2 semesters off in a row. And many of you are really struggling in your position. So keep in mind the little spiel that I'm about to do. It may not apply to you because I definitely don't want to put any pressure on anybody to financially support a show that they're not in a position to financially support. That's really not what this is about. But basically, the way that I fund my show is through ad sales and through the support of listeners just like you, so I can keep it free. I'm not on a podcast network. I'm not part of a collective. When I first started the show, how many years ago? What is it, like 7 now? I don't even know. I did it by myself. It's all been independent from the beginning. And now I don't do it by myself anymore. I'm lucky enough that I'm able to pay my assistant, Noelle, shout out to Noelle, to help with booking and things like that. And also I have an editor who helps out with all of my post-production. And, that don't come cheap. And weirdly, ad sales haven't been great during the pandemic. Listenership for a lot of podcasts is up, but for mine, it's actually down. And I don't know if that's just because maybe it's a little too real for y'all. Well, I don't know who I'm talking to. You're actually listening, so your listenership is not down. But maybe because it's not a comedy show, it's a science show. I'm not really sure. But I think one of the best ways to support the show during these times is to really just tell people about it. Share it on social media, tell your friends and family, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all the different ways that you can do that. Download it if it shows up in your feed, even if you don't plan on listening to it for a little while. That can be uber helpful because every hit is recorded as an ad impression. And that's, of course, how we make our money. So what was I going to say? Oh, but of course, the listener support is still probably the biggest way that the show can remain on the air and remain free for everybody to download. And listener support happens by visiting patreon.com/talknerdy and pledging your support. Again, if and only if you're in a position to do so. So I want to thank the top patrons this week. They include Mary Neva, Charles Payet, Christopher Pitts, David J.E. Smith, Dudas Infinitas, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Brian Holden, Michael Gaucher, and of course, Daniel Lang. Thank you all so, so much. You are the reason this podcast keeps on churning. Okay, let's talk about this week's show. I got to interview not just the authors, but the researchers behind the book that they wrote about this amazing study that they completed. So let's talk about that. The book is called Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. And it was written by Doctors Jennifer Hirsch, who's a professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, and Dr. Shamus Khan, the chair of Columbia's Sociology Department. So they did a deep dive through an initiative or a study called the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation. In short, that's SHIFT. So it's a comprehensive research project that looks at all these different factors that shape sexual health and sexual violence, specifically for the undergraduate population at Columbia. So it's not just a book about sexual assault on campus, although that's a big part of it. It's also a book about sexual citizenry and sexual health. Such an important topic, a topic that, is relevant to everybody. So whether you're in college, whether you went to college, whether you have kids that are thinking or planning or eventually going to go to college, or even if you live in the world, sexual assault and just, sexual intimacy, sexual respect, consent, all of these issues are issues that apply to most everybody. And I mean, at this point, if you are not a woman who has experienced assault or harassment, you probably still know somebody who has. So, guys, this is a profoundly important topic, and it was a real honor to have the very researchers who dug deep into it and wrote this wonderful book about it. So, guys, without any further ado, here they are, Doctors Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. Well, Jennifer and Shamus, I am so excited to be chatting with both of you today. Thank you so much for both being available at the same time so that we could do this full conversation.
We're delighted to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. Yes. So, okay. I think because we don't typically do kind of one-on-two interviews on the show, I'm excited to maybe orient everybody a little bit before we dive into the book to who you are and what it is that you do.
So my name is Shamus Khan. I'm a sociologist. I teach at Columbia University, and my background is really in studying inequality. The early work I did was looking at rich people and sort of talking about how wealthy people drove a lot of inequality. And then recently I joined Jennifer on this massive project as part of a big research team to better understand sexual assault that was happening on college campuses.
Very cool.
I am an anthropologist. I'm a professor at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. And I've spent my whole career working on cultural and social influences on reproductive health. My first scientific paper that I wrote was actually about Mexican dirty jokes as a system of informal sex education. And in 2014, I started with Claude-Anne Mellon's the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, which was a big project funded by Columbia University to look at sexual assault among undergraduates on the Columbia and Barnard campuses. And Shamus and I worked together leading the ethnographic component, which we'll be talking about today.
And is that study still ongoing? Is it still kind of an initiative that folks are working on, or has it since closed?
Well, data are forever. And so we are still working on papers with the larger SHIFT team, but we're no longer collecting any data. So we still have more things to say about the data we collected.
Okay, so maybe we should take a second to talk about SHIFT, as you mentioned, the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation. So was this, I should say, a data collection effort that was specific to Columbia University, looking at different students on campus?
So when I was looking at the national conversation that people were having about campus sexual assault in 2014, it seemed to me that there was something missing. There was a lot of talk about improving systems of adjudication, which is very important. And there was a notion circulating, it was right around when the movie The Hunting Ground came out. And so of sort of sociopathic perpetrators and serial rapists lurking behind bushes, lying in wait. And it seemed to me, I've spent my whole career looking at social factors that shape sexual behavior, including forms of interaction that are distressing and hurtful. My previous book was on the social organization of infidelity. And so I thought, if we look at what makes sexual assault happen on college campuses, we could do something about preventing it at a bigger scale. And so Shift was born from that feeling that something was missing in the conversation. I approached the leadership at Columbia. They were excited about the idea. I reached out to my friend Claude. We put together this giant sort of moonshot level team of mostly Columbia affiliated faculty and move forward with a study that included ethnographic research where you are immersed deeply in students' daily lives, as well as two forms of survey research and engagement with both students and administrators to think about the implications of what we found for what prevention might actually look like.
And this culminated in like a massive amount of data, right? Like how kind of what percentage of like the student body, the faculty, were you able to collect data from and reach through the study?
So it depends on what instrument we're talking about. The survey that Claude Mellons had run was a survey of just over 1,600 students, and we were only looking at undergraduates. So, and it was a random population survey, and so what that meant is, in terms of the scientific quality of the survey, basically we had a very good sample of the overall student population, and we had a really strong response rate, 66%, which is way better than just about any other sex survey out there. And so through that, we reached, over 1,600 students. As part of our research team for the ethnographic portion of the project, we interviewed 151 students. We also did hundreds of hours of participant observation. And what that means is that Jennifer and I were kind of hanging out in public places around campus, so dining halls, at sporting events, et cetera. But we also hired a group of people who not just look younger, are actually younger than we are, and who hung out in fraternity basements, religious student organizations, who were on buses to athletic events, who were in, kind of hanging out in dorms with the young people on campus. And through that, we reached a lot of students. And then we also did focus groups with about, I would say, between 150 and 200 students. And so all told, there's probably some overlap, but we reached, I would say, about 2,000 students on campus. And really the aim here was to pull back the curtain on college life. And so the study is very much a study of sexual assault, but it seeks to place the explanations for why sexual assault happens in a context of what is campus life like? What is it like to be a college student today? And so all of these different methods allowed us to do that. And in the book, Sexual Citizens, we draw primarily on the ethnographic portion of the design, which is to say, to give people a sense of the day-to-day life and experience of campus, and then the stories of students with their experiences with sex and with sexual assault.
Right. I mean, it sounds like it was really robust. So even though, a lot of people listening who might be used to reading about like medical studies or, like large population surveys, you guys obviously collected data from many, many students for one of the portions of your study, but the ethnographic portion, which I might liken, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, because I come from a psychology background, to more like a qualitative data analysis. That's still a lot of people to go kind of to that deep level of like a qualitative analysis. When you're talking hundreds of people, I mean, there's probably data to mine for many dissertations to come.
It certainly is a lot of data. And I think that one thing that is distinctive about ethnographic research is the way it opens the door into how people experience their daily lives. So, and you can learn things about what you're studying that otherwise would be inaccessible. So, Austin was someone who he was interviewed, and he also got to know one of the interviewers, and so they spent time together, sort of as in Austin's daily life. But he told us a story. The first part of his story, you can see sort of what a sweet young man he had grown into. He described a hot summer night with his girlfriend. It's like the only really steamy sex scene in the book. Where it was the 4th of July, and we'll just say they made their own fireworks. But he also described to us an experience that he had early in his freshman year. His roommate had a girlfriend, and so they wanted to be alone, and he got shuffled back into the bedroom where the roommate's girlfriend's roommate was sleeping in this, the sort of tidal way that students flow in and out of each other's dorm rooms. And so he gets to her room late at night, and she mumbles to him drunkenly, "I don't really want to do anything." And like that, what kind of world is it where like someone comes into your bedroom, it's your bedroom, and the first thing you need to say is like that you're not interested in sex with them if you're,
right.
So there was that. But then he proceeded to recount to us how, despite her having said that to him, he got in bed with her and started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself and he was like, "Nope, this isn't the thing." But in recounting that experience to us, he became distraught. He hadn't until the interview labeled it sexual assault. So if you were just surveying him, he might not have been even in a place where he would express to you that what he had done, which was unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching, he didn't see himself as an assaulter. And that was part of why he became so distraught in telling that story. So ethnography gives you the opportunity to get to know people well enough that you can learn things about what you're trying to study that otherwise would be inaccessible.
Right. And it sounds like there's kind of a trust that develops. So people are willing to open up in a way as well that they wouldn't be able to do on like a first meeting, a second meeting, even a third meeting with a researcher per se. And one other thing that kind of, I don't know, is sticking out to me is that, when I think of like the social science literature, but again, because my background is psych, I tend to kind of think in those terms. I often think about kind of the sort of the understanding or the joke that what we know in the psychology literature is a whole lot about like university undergrads. And that's because most psychology studies are done on college campuses just because it's a convenient sample. And so oftentimes we talk about reproducibility crisis in psychology, and we talk about the fact that maybe all these studies that are collected on college undergrads don't really represent the greater population as a whole. But you guys were actually interested in sexual assault on campus, or at least sexual behavior on campus. So how kind of perfect that you had this sort of this convenience population that you were able to dig really deep into in your day-to-day of carrying out this study.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are limitations to what we did in terms of, just the campus that we studied, Columbia University and Barnard College, is not a typical college campus. And in fact, no college campus is a typical college campus. But it's important to remember that it's a campus that's embedded in the city of New York, which is a very unique city in the United States and even in the world, that it's a hyper elite campus, that it's a campus that is residential. And most college students don't actually go to residential colleges. And so, there's all of this uniqueness to what it is that we studied. But we really hope that the main conceptual apparatus that we generate in the book, these sort of three guiding concepts of sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies, can be used to analyze other contexts. So the idea is sort of to generate a sort of framing device or even a theoretical framework that may not generate exactly the same insights, but that could be applied in places that aren't, say, Columbia and Barnard campuses.
Right. And I think that before we get into those three concepts, I'm not sure if you could answer this statistically, but I guess I'm more interested in your opinion. Do you feel like a sample like you were able to collect at Columbia, which, as you said, is more of a residential university, as opposed to maybe where I went to school, which is a commuter college, like a state school. Do you feel like the problem is maybe a little bit more intractable, or at least more relevant or prevalent even on a campus where most of the kids live there?
I mean, data across multiple campuses has shown that sexual assault is a problem everywhere. And I think
Okay.
it's also been shown that sexual assault for women in this age group, they're actually more likely to be assaulted if they're not college students. Um,
Interesting.
and again, referring back to what Seamus said, I think in terms of generalizability, obviously there are characteristics of the Columbian Barnard environment that are very particular, but the kinds of questions that we ask this is maybe to nerd out like a little bit, but I feel like this is the audience to do it for.
Hell yeah.
Like ethnographic generalizability doesn't mean that what we found on the Columbia Barnard campus is what you're going to find on a different campus. It means that the questions that we asked and the model that we bring to thinking about the problem will be useful anywhere. And so it's more about are the questions generally useful than it is about whether the particulars of the ethnographic context are the same, because obviously
Gotcha.
like different things are different in different places, as anthropologists say. So it's not about the particularity being the same so much as it is about the way to think about the problem.
Right. And of course, it's a big problem. And so let's talk a little bit about how these things were conceptualized and what some of the takeaways were. So Seamus, you mentioned these three concepts, sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies. So I think to most people, those sound just like, without any context, those are words. Like maybe we can take a little bit of time to dive into what these constructs actually are.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll start with sexual projects, and this concept actually emerges directly out of Jennifer's earlier work. But sexual projects is the answer for the question, like, what is sex for? So, you might think only an academic could ask a question like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, it's sort of an important question because you need to understand why people are trying to have the kinds of sexual experiences that they're trying to have. And people have sex for lots of different reasons. Some people have sex because they want to acquire new experiences. Some people have sex to give comfort to a partner. Some people have sex to increase the status of the group that they're a part of. Some people, most people, a lot of people have sex for pleasure. And so knowing what people are doing when they're having sex, that is, what is it that they're trying to sort of accomplish for themselves, for their sense of self, is really important. And so when Jennifer and I say, sexual projects, it's probably the case that people at Columbia and Barnard have some different kinds of sexual projects than students in other contexts. But critically important is the idea that this might be a useful question for people to ask, like, what is my sexual project? What does sex do for me? How does it help me define myself and who I am?
Okay, so before we move on to the other constructs, maybe we can talk about some of the findings, like some of the things that you learned with regards to this conceptualization. Like, were there divisions by gender lines? Did you tend to see divisions by age? Or was it really that there's just like a lot of variance within the group?
So the sexual project of having sex to accumulate experience, or to accrue status, we found puts people at risk for assaulting other people or for being assaulted. So there was one young man we spoke with who, before he got to campus, had made up a list of the girls he wanted to have sex with based on their Facebook profiles. And so that wasn't necessarily thinking like his regarding them as objects of achievement, as we describe in the book, was a setup for potentially assaulting them. And, I could tell another story about Diana, who was at a party freshman year, and all of a sudden she was, in a suite with a bunch of upperclassmen. All of a sudden her friends left, and then his friends left, and she was alone with this older guy. And she described it as like some kind of alpha male shit, where he instructed her to take her clothes off, and she gave him a blowjob, and they had sex, and then he handed her clothes back to her. And sort of dismissed her. And on the way out, she saw that his friends had been listening at the door. So like that was a gross and kind of humiliating experience. It wasn't assault. And that's one of the ways actually that our book is really distinctive, is that we widen out the lens and don't just look at sex that is potentially breaking the law, but also at the ways that students can be pretty unkind to each other.
Right.
And so what's interesting, I mean, there are many, many things that I could say about that interaction, but then the next morning she passed her phone around at brunch to show her friends about the guy that she'd gotten with, because for her, in that moment in her life, she chose to disregard what an unpleasant experience it had been, because it was still a pretty good shit to pass around. He was an older hot guy. And so then, as we describe more in Sexual Citizens, that actually sets her up. That way of thinking about sex as conquest and achievement sets her up later for assaulting someone she really cared about. So Shamus and I are not judgy about what the right sexual project is. I mean, I'm judgy with my kids about what the right sexual project is. But as scientists, our job is not to say what's a better sexual project, but to lift up the ways in which different sexual projects, including intimacy, can produce vulnerability to assault.
You know, a critical thing here highlights the sort of public health approach that we take in Sexual Citizens and really in Shift. And the idea of a public health approach is, you know, rather than yell at people to act better, like just be better people. You know, the public health approach says, like, you know, our A game is not really in berating people into being better. It's thinking, how do we change contexts in such a way that they're actually sort of naturally guided to act in better ways? So if you think about sort of smoking or obesity or any kinds of things, drinking behaviors, like saying to people, you know, don't smoke, isn't nearly as effective as changing aspects of the context that they live in order to transform their smoking behavior. And the approach that we take with sexual assault is sort of to expand the conversation beyond don't rape anybody and don't get raped, and don't let your friends get raped, as the kinds of interventions that we're doing. And instead to say, how do we change the environment so that they're less likely to experience those things? I mean, don't get us wrong. Like, we think there should be clear messaging that says, don't rape anybody and look out for your friends. But we also think, like, that's not really going to be sufficient. If we've learned anything in public health, it's not going to be sufficient as a prevention strategy. And that's really what Sexual Citizens is all about.
So it does bring up kind of a question for me before we, you know, dive deeper into these concepts of like the messaging, kind of the socially accepted messaging and the historical impact of entrenched sexism, that often what we see after a really, you know, brutal assault, or when something kind of comes into public consciousness, is this messaging to women to like be more careful, be more alert, be more assertive, don't dress this way, don't act this way, make sure that your consent is verbal, make sure. Whereas the messaging towards boys or men of like don't rape women seems to somehow get lost, almost like, oh, well, that's an assumption, we shouldn't have to overtly say it. Do you think that there is a deep kind of cultural problem where boys aren't taught about consent or about safety or about, you know, their role in this problem as much as they should be?
One of the things that we do in Sexual Citizens is to situate sexual assault in relation to those socially organized inequalities between men and women. So to talk about sexism and men's disregard for women's voices, but then also to go beyond that and think about what power looks like in a lot of different ways. So I'll tell you a story that fits into and challenges sort of the paradigm that you proposed. So Lucy was a freshman and she had gone to boarding school. She was excited to get to campus, to party, to lose her virginity. And so it seemed like everything was going according to plan when she was out at a bar during orientation week and she met she and her friend Nancy met two seniors, and they bought them drinks, and they flirted, and they danced, and Scott invited Lucy back to the fraternity house. And so they stumble up Amsterdam in the warm summer evening, and this was what she wanted. She wanted to be close to him, to get to know him, maybe to make out with him. But she didn't want to be raped. And she went up, he invited her into the fraternity house. She went up the stairs, then up to the second floor because he offered to make her a drink, then up to his bedroom. And I think it still seemed, as she recounted it, it seemed to be going according to plan to her. And then he started to take off her pants. And she was like, "No, don't." To which he said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay because she had said no to him. And then he assaulted her, he raped her. And so, you can think about that story within that dynamic of nobody ever told him not to rape women, except he was told not to do that, right? Because that's part of everyone's orientation. And part of the message of Sexual Citizens is that sex is not a cognitive behavior, it's a social behavior. And sexual assault is also not a cognitive behavior. And so it doesn't matter that he got the consent education session because that's not what shapes people's behavior. In that moment, the most charitable interpretation that we could make of his behavior, I mean, you could say maybe he's a sociopath. Maybe he set out and then, got her drunk on purpose to assault her. But maybe he was just unaware of how much more powerful he was in that interaction.
Right.
Not just the gender thing, but he had 3 years on her, so he knows how people act in college. Whereas the prime directive of orientation week is not to be embarrassing. He was in a building surrounded by his friends. He had a lot more sexual experience than she did. He probably was much less drunk than she was. So in the book, we complicate the ways that people think about power by talking not just about those social dimensions of power, like gender or social class or race, but also situational dimensions of power that might render somebody unaware of just how silencing they can be to the other person. Because I mean, there certainly are assaults that happen where the person who perpetrates the assault intentionally is harming a peer. But where the easier work is, where the lighter lift is for prevention, is to get at what we talk about in the book as assaults, acts of entitlement, right? Where people are just not really paying attention to the other person. And so what that suggests is that we could be doing a lot better at teaching young people to be aware of their own social power and reminding them to pay attention that the people they're having sex with are people.
And of course, that kind of lack of awareness of privilege or of power underlies a lot of social problems in society, from sexism to racism. Obviously, that's a big part of the conversation that a lot of people are having right now around Black Lives Matter. And it also reminds me of some of the more kind of extreme cases that you see in the media, all the way from the most egregious, a Jeffrey Epstein, where even when the girls weren't underage and they were quote unquote consenting, there was obviously a power differential that, you could pretty well argue that actually wasn't consent, all the way to maybe the Louis C.K. situations where you will sometimes hear these retorts that well, I'm a nerd and I didn't realize why would she even want to be around me? And the fact that she did that, I mean, I felt great about it and I didn't realize she was uncomfortable. And it's no, but you're also very famous. How do you not know that plays into the power differential? And also with, professors or any situation where somebody has, some sort of currency or control in the relationship, the fact that so many people are just blissfully unaware that power differential exists is really, really worrisome.
I think that, we have to push it a little bit further than that because, it's not just that there are people who have power and they use that power to assault others. That's certainly the case. But let's take the LGBTQ community.
Yes.
They experience some of the highest rates of assault of any group. And for the most part, it's not the football team that's doing that. It's actually happening within the community. And, one of the ways to analyze that is to think about how it is that power works within that community and how it is that power is deeply structural, that power works upon young gay and queer people in really important ways. So, two stories I think are really would kind of illustrate this. One is this young man, Adam, who identified as gay and came from a really conservative family, and he just sort of like couldn't be out at home, and he couldn't wait to get to Columbia. But when he got to New York, he wasn't that happy there because he was his conservative family had some impact on like what he saw as an ideal relationship. So he's sort of sick of guys who said they were interested in dating and then would hook up with him and then just ghost him or never really talk to him again. And he finally found a boyfriend he really liked, and he really liked his boyfriend. But he also, kind of confessed to us or confided in us that his boyfriend is really forceful about sex. And he told us a story about how his boyfriend came home drunk one night, and in Adam's word, he basically raped me. And in this story, I think there's a way at which you could say, well, Adam's boyfriend was exerting power upon him. But I think you can't explain it without understanding the kind of structural stigmas that exist among and within the gay community about all of those previous experiences that he had that produced a lot of silence around sex and a lot of shame in his own sexuality. And I certainly think we should, hold Adam's boyfriend to account in that context. But we also might look at power not just as like the thing that his boyfriend did or the thing that his boyfriend had, but the situational context that made, his experience of his own sexuality not necessarily something that made him feel empowered to express his own voice.
Right. And I think you do see kind of similar, you're right. I think power is a lot more complicated than something that somebody does. And you see this kind of expressed also oftentimes when you look at, how women might be socialized, specific women, especially maybe women who are raised in like really traditional households with like traditional religious gender roles or something where it's kind of like, I don't want to speak up, or maybe I'm not just really comfortable asserting myself, or maybe like I'm lucky that this person even wants to be with me. I often worry that kind of mentality of like self-shame definitely contributes to these really uncomfortable and potentially dangerous interactions. And I think you see that often too with and I saw it in my own clinical work with young girls who I worked with who were previously victims of sex trafficking, is that they were much more likely to be re-victimized and to be abused in the future because of A, being in these unsafe situations, but B, I think there are a lot of like really sad internalized psychological issues that end up actually having a significant role in these kinds of interactions. Do you think, Shamus, just to follow up on that, we often hear about within the LGBTQ communities these almost like stratifications of violence or abuse where like trans women actually tend to deal with the highest levels of both sexual violence and physical violence, and it sort of like stratifies from there. Do you think that these are mostly like due to the social stigma around what it means to be a trans woman in American society? Do you see that this plays out on college campuses as well?
So it's going to be hard for us to speak to that in part because even though we interviewed, say, 150 people and interacted with hundreds more, there just aren't that many trans people that we spoke to. I think we spoke to, and Jennifer, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, it was 6 or 8 genderqueer people who identified sort of not in the binary of male-female, and which included some trans people. And so to make distinctions within our population of interest isn't really something that we can speak to, but we can speak to the particular experiences of some of the trans folks that we spoke to. And like another story was with one of the people we interviewed was transitioning from, they were born male at birth, and they were transitioning to identifying as a trans woman. And their partner sort of constantly wanted to use, they used they pronouns, constantly wanted to use their penis during sex, which they really experienced as identity invalidating. And this particular context wasn't really one where like they were being compelled to do something by force or anything like that. But in other stories, where some of the trans people we spoke to were told, like, by their partners who wanted to have sex with them, and when they didn't really want to have sex, well, you don't think I'm beautiful, and they sort of knew how hard that hit to feel like you weren't beautiful to other people, and this was a way in which people used power or the kinds of stigmas and disadvantages that they carried with them through their lives influenced the ways in which they felt like they could express themselves during sex. And, it really gets to the second concept of sexual citizenship, which is the idea that, what we found is that people didn't have the sense that they had the right to say yes and the right to say no to sex, and that other people had the same rights. And that's what sexual citizenship is. And, one of the great failures I think we identify in the book is that we aren't raising young people with a deep sense of their own sexual citizenship, of their right to say yes and their right to say no to sex, as well as, the kind of commitment to ensuring that the people that they're having sex with are people and not kind of, human scratching posts or something like that, that the other people have that same equivalent right. And so, a lot of what we suggest at the end of the book is like, how can we transform the ways in which we're raising young people so that they can be more fully formed sexual citizens? And a lot of that project is a project of equality, a project of respecting kind of the sexual and gender identities of people. And actually, as we spend a good bit of time talking about in the book, a project of racial justice.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and you'd think that another layer on top of that is just the amount of kind of, I don't know, guilt and shame and sort of like puritanical thinking that is very specific, maybe not specific, but somewhat unique to American society. This kind of strange taboo around sex that maybe if we can't talk about it freely, and maybe if we can't express exactly what our wishes and desires are, and sort of be ourselves and understand our true intents, maybe our own sexual projects, right? Be more honest with ourselves about them. That maybe that would be a little bit more freeing and kind of encourage mutual respect. But it seems like it's often very kind of under the radar, something we don't talk about, something we just are supposed to like dwell on and sort of wallow in. And that obviously doesn't seem healthy.
I mean, there's no question that shame and silence are part of the context that produces sexual assault. If you think about driving as a contrast, like so much social effort goes into ensuring that young people can learn how to drive in a way that they don't harm themselves or other people, right? There's like the whole edifice of driver's ed, and there's a licensing procedure. We're not suggesting that people should have licenses to have sex, but just giving a metaphor here. And road design and car design, and we have actually, public health have done a great job at bringing down traffic fatalities, over the past, since cars were invented. So it has become a much safer thing to do because we recognize driving as a legitimate social practice. So that when someone says, I want to learn to drive, the parent's response is, not under my roof, right? No, the parent is like, no, okay, fine. Well, let's get you signed up for driver's ed. And, if a kid says, I want to learn to have sex, the parent's response is frequently not, let me take you to the doctor to make sure that you have adequate and appropriate sexual and reproductive health care. No, it's not under my roof. And so that message of shame doesn't set young people up well. If the only thing that they've been told their whole lives is that they should say no, then it doesn't position them well to figure out when they want to say yes, which I think makes it hard for them to articulate that or to hear other people. So
Right.
what we argue for in the book is a recognition of young people's sexual citizenship as a sort of fundamental collective step towards preventing campus sexual assault.
And it's not even just like you were saying at the sort of nuclear family level. Like, I think you do kind of see these mentalities or these internalizations broadened out even to public health. Obviously, like in the most progressive departments and views, these are the kinds of ideas that are promoted. But I can tell you that even when I was working in a group home doing therapy with adolescent girls, often who had histories of pretty bad abuse or what we called C-sex, so commercial sexual exploitation of children, so trafficking backgrounds, really had been victimized. We didn't even give out condoms when the girl, like, this was a big conversation that was always back and forth. Like, if a girl is going to AWOL and say, I'm leaving, I'm not going to come back tonight, like, shouldn't we be talking about how to protect themselves and how to be safe, knowing what's going to happen? Like, let's be honest with ourselves. We know that there's a big risk for something to be happening, but instead we just kind of pretend that that's not the case. Like, it's bananas that these are the types of policies that you see across the country.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, we spend a lot of our time talking to often, not all of them were advantaged, but often very advantaged students who've done incredibly well in school. I mean, they, kind of got into the Ivy League. And so, their pathway to college hadn't necessarily been easy. But, one young man told us a story about having, sex with his girlfriend and how difficult it was because, to quote him, she didn't even know where her holes were. Like, she had no conceptualization of her body. And, this is a social policy decision where we've decided that we want people to be ignorant about sex. And it creates a series of challenges. And it also creates, a sense that there's something deeply wrong about sex. And, you can't really have a conversation about sexual assault without also talking about substance use. And, one young woman said to us, well, alcohol's kind of like Novocaine before going to the dentist. And what she meant was that, like, it numbed her and allowed her to have the sex that she kind of wanted to have, but she couldn't bring herself to have without that numbing effect of alcohol. And, I think it's so important, to take one of the take homes of the book is that this shame and this silence that we're producing around sex is having real harms. And one of the harms, as Jennifer said just, a few moments ago, is that from our perspective, it is making sexual assault more rather than less likely.
Right. Like, when something becomes kind of more taboo, there's more shame around it. It becomes more restrictive and there's less kind of free conversation and, I don't know, pride, self-worth, self-efficacy, all of those things, and empathy. Of course, you're going to see this like underbelly. Jennifer, I'm interested just because I'm realizing that I don't want to keep you for too long. We've talked about sexual projects, and we still have to get to sexual citizenship and sexual geographies. I know we've kind of touched on them, but maybe we can take a minute to talk about what exactly sexual citizenship is.
So, sexual citizenship is the understanding that people have the right to choose the sex that they're going to have, and that they understand that other people have that same right. So, we spoke to a young woman, we call her Gwen in the book, who, a tall, blonde, beautiful, fell very easily into the New York club scene. And she came into the interview with like a whole list of things to tell us about in terms of her sexual encounters. And on that list was, she would go to clubs and meet, sort of like B-list actors and not very famous athletes. And she was very clear she didn't want to have intercourse with them. And so when she went back to their hotel rooms with them, they'd fool around. And then she described to us how she would give them a blowjob to get out of there. And so that feeling of being obligated to someone else to produce sexual pleasure for them without any real thought about what you want or what feels good to you. And all of those men who assumed that was a reasonable social exchange. I mean, imagine if you you were in a social relationship with someone, and every time you got together with them for dinner, only one of you cooked and the other one always ate, right? Like, how unequal is that? And yet that has become so normalized. And so through the idea of sexual citizenship, we lift up the importance of doing better to teach people about other people's right to sexual self-determination, which men are not always taught to see women's right to sexual self-determination. And women are frequently not taught to feel so secure in their own right to sexual self-determination. But
and that has a long history, right? I mean, there's kind of reason for that if you look back to the transactional nature of men's and women's interactions when we're talking about these kind of binary relationships.
Yes. And I think that I want to pivot because in some ways, what is most revolutionary about the book is the attention to sexual geographies. We've talked a lot in our conversation today about sort of how ideas and shared beliefs shape sex and sexual assault. But the true glory of public health is the focus on the environment. And so when we talk about sexual geographies, we mean the ways in which the actual spatial context that people move through and the power inequalities that are built into that context produce opportunities for sexual assault. So think about a dorm room, for example. Like when two students go back to a dorm room together, there's 4 pieces of furniture in that room. There's a dresser, a desk chair, and a bed. And so you pretty much have to sit on the bed, right? Or you can stay down. And then sitting on the bed, like beds have social meanings. That is unavoidable. And so a way to radically change the horizon of possibility is to think about dorms that have more couches outside of bedrooms. It's not that we're not anti-sex at all, but the funneling of drunk people who may or may not want to have sex back to rooms where the only place they can be together is a bed, that's a sexual assault opportunity structure, and it's one that institutions can modify.
Right. And that's so when you talk about this kind of sexual geography, are you really mostly talking about these very, I don't know how I would put it, but like microcosmic geographies, things like where these interactions take place? Or are you also talking about regional differences?
So, I mean, it has to do with, as Jennifer just said, something as basic as furniture. Like we literally do need furniture. And this is, part of a long tradition of thinking about how it is that space and spatial dynamics produce particular kinds of interactions. But it has more, it's more than that. I mean, if you think about who has control over space and the ways in which space and power are intimately intertwined, it really expands, the sort of purview of what we could do to address this. So, 2 other examples. Think about the naturalization that older students get better space on campus. And in particular, they get access to better space where typically parties or other kinds of social functions happen. What that means is that younger students get funneled out of spaces that they control into spaces that older students control. And, that creates all kinds of risks for those younger students. The second to look at would be, and it's not just Greek life, but Greek life is an important example here where by national rule, and this is national rule of Greek organizations, fraternities are allowed to serve alcohol and sororities are not. And
I had no idea. What?
Yeah, and so this effectively gives men control over a non-trivial part of the college experience's distribution of alcohol in party space. And, these are social policies about space. It also has to do, as we've said a few times in this interview, with race in space and the ways in which, white students and white people in general drink more than others. And the assumption that a college experience is an experience where people get drunk a lot is actually kind of an assumption of whiteness. But it also means that a lot of the college spaces where drinking happens are controlled by white men. And if you return to the analysis of power that we sort of are trying to push towards, it's one where gender and power matters a lot. The men piece of that is important. But so too is the piece that it's more senior men or older men. So too is the fact that it's white men who control that space. And, we heard stories from students who said, like, they kind of got pushed off campus among friends where they felt safe into other spaces in the city where they were at greater risk, in part because they experienced college as a quote unquote white space. So, one young woman that we spoke to in the book, and all the names we use, by the way, are pseudonyms, she told us the story of like just feeling like she was a woman of color who didn't feel like the white men on campus were really that attracted to her. She didn't like the music that they played. And so, to find a sexual partner, she eventually kind of ended up chatting with this guy who she met through a roommate who lived out in Brooklyn. And she ends up way out in Brooklyn going to visit him. The entire experience of getting there is kind of a disaster. It's pouring rain. She ends up kind of peeling off her shoes and socks, and they, roll a joint and they smoke a little bit and they're watching TV. And, the long story short is he ends up raping her. She says, no, she doesn't want to have sex. And he just continues to push forward through it. And one way to analyze that encounter is through a lens of gender and power of this man. But another is to say, how it was that she was driven off campus, in part because of the ways in which white-controlled spaces made campus a less comfortable place for us. Another reason that, explains what she experienced was class, where other students could kind of flip open their phone, or I guess nobody has flip phones anymore, turn on their phone and call an Uber or call a car to take them home. She couldn't afford $50 to get back from deep Brooklyn into Morningside Heights in Manhattan. And so she was kind of more stuck there than other kinds of students. And so here it kind of tries to bring together this analysis of thinking about the spatial dimensions, how those are tied to power and other forms of inequality that make sexual assault in some ways a predictable but modifiable aspect of campus life.
And so, the corollary of that, like why this is so exciting, is that it's a whole new vision of what sexual assault prevention can look like. That is, for decades, like, back in the Pleistocene era, when I was a college student, there was one Take Back the Night March on campus every year. And, there were videos about date rape that got shown to groups of powerful men, but like nothing has changed for decades in terms of the rates of campus sexual assault. And so the book is, you might think it would be depressing to read a book about sexual assault. I mean, some of the stories are hard, but overall, the tone is hope and optimism, because Shamus and I are sure we as a society can do so much better at preventing campus sexual assault when people understand that sexual assault on campus, it's not a campus problem, it's an everyone problem. And so that means everyone, parents, K through 12 educational institutions, religious institutions, youth serving organizations, summer camps when there are summer camps again. Like everybody has a role to play in preparing young people to have sex in a way that doesn't hurt other people.
And I mean, I guess this actually does lead me to sort of the last question before we wrap up, which is, and maybe this is something that's been sticking out in most people's minds. And Shamus, you did sort of, in some ways already answer it, but I would love maybe to talk just succinctly about what it is about college campuses. And is that even the way to be thinking about this problem? Because I think we as a society are very interested. We have kind of defined this as a specific problem to the college experience. We know that rape and sexual assault is a much larger problem than college, but there does seem to be something, I don't know, specific, maybe not worse, but unique about what is happening across college campuses. Is that a true statement? And if it is, why is that the case?
So, I mean, one of the critical things about college campuses is that they're collections of young people who are sort of between the ages of 17 and, say, 23, which is a critical period for people's sexual development. And, as we sort of said before, that there isn't a ton of evidence that suggests that colleges are particularly risky places. But the conversation that Jennifer and I really want to have is not, to sort of ask, like, are colleges really bad or are they really good, et cetera, et cetera. It's how do we get ahead of this problem? And as it turns out, the way that we get ahead of this problem, which is to say, how do we prevent it, is by fundamentally transforming the ways in which we raise young people. In the survey that was led by Claudine Mellons, we find, and this is consistent with results from lots of other surveys, that one of the strongest predictors of being assaulted in college is having been assaulted in high school. We're actually coming at this way too late. And the kinds of sexual education that we need to provide with young people, the ways in which we cultivate their sense of sexual citizenship and make them aware of power inequalities, that's something that has to start way, way, way earlier. And if we can do that, as Jennifer said, I think we're both really hopeful that we can actually move the needle to make sexual assault a less common experience, not only for students in college, but for students who are not in college.
Right. So whether you're 15 or 19 or 23 or even 55, and whether you're at a historically Black university or you're at a private institution, a public college, or not college at all, working in retail or in food service or in corporate America, like these issues affect everybody. And so this microcosm that is the university setting is sort of a magnifying glass for some of these like larger social issues that you guys really do address in the book.
Exactly. Yes.
Awesome. Well, guys, I know, Jennifer and Shamus, that I promised you that I would only keep you an hour. I was hoping that right before we sign off, that I could maybe ask you guys the same two questions that I ask everybody when they come on the show. And since there's two of you, you can handle this how you like. Maybe one can take one and the other can take the other, or you can each kind of give me your quick response. But they're sort of big picture questions. And as public health and sociology professionals, I'm definitely interested in your take on these questions. So, you guys good with that?
Yeah, sure.
All right, here we go. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now. So it could be, the direction of your work. It could be like broader social or global issues, or it could even be something a little more personal, family, friends, whatever. And I want you to tell me, number one, what is the thing that's really keeping you up the most at night, that you're most like concerned about, pessimistic, maybe even, I don't know, cynical about, just things that aren't looking good. And on the flip side of that, what is the thing, if you had to pick one, that you are optimistic about, that you are actually really looking forward to?
So I'll take the optimism one because I am a glass half full person.
Nice.
And I think I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but today when we're speaking, it's the day after primary day in New York State. We had some really big progressive wins in yesterday's election. And I am excited about the new generation of people who have stepped into politics because literally the fucking world is on fire.
Right.
And the baby boomers are not going to save us. And I am so optimistic about the women, people of color, queer people, queer women of color, the new generation of leaders, I think, see the depth of the problems that we face and the breadth of the solutions that are required. And that includes thinking about addressing sexual assault in relation to policies like comprehensive sex ed. So that I feel excited about that.
And what keeps me up at night is kind of what always has kept me up at night, and it's inequality. And, I may be the kind of person where I have a hammer and the whole world is a nail, but, that when we're doing this research on sexual assault, one of the critical things that we see is how much inequalities are a part of this. And I share with Jennifer that optimism that maybe this new group of people can address it. But fundamentally, inequality isn't just about our economic condition. It's something about how we view other people and whether or not we recognize their fundamental human dignity. And so I think if we can't tackle the question of inequality, something like sexual assault is not really going to be fully addressed. And so I am hopeful, as Jennifer is, for this kind of new wave of young people. In doing the research that we did, I was so inspired by the students that we spoke to and who shared their lives with. And I think, the boomers, like, not only are they not going to save us, they actually kind of dug a lot of the hole, and they need to get out of the way now and let the young people actually lead us to a place where we need to be.
Hear, hear. Well, guys, the book is Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus by Doctors Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I learned an awful lot.
Thank you for making time to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks for raising up our work. It was great to have the conversation.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.